familiar with that. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, the third in our series regarding the proposed Title IX rules and what to do about it, how to make sense of it, what are some ongoing conversations hopefully you are already having on your campus, and if not, hopefully this will be another catalyst and lens to look through as we all try to make our way through this murky process. If you have a phone or a tablet that you are also kind of working from as you listen in today, I just ask that you keep it away from the computer and or phone that you are listening to the webinar through. We have had some issues in the past with some feedback noise, disrupting presentations in that area. I am recording this webinar today. So if you yourself or anybody else on your campus would like a copy of it, you can definitely send me an email at the conclusion of the presentation, and I will be happy to send you a link for either you to review or for you to share with other colleagues on campus at any point, or they can email me directly too. Without further ado then, I think I will just turn it over. Oh, also, if you have any questions for our presenters, please enter those into the chat room on your screen, and they will be able to address those as time allows for them during their presentation. So thank you to Kate Lawson at Xavier University, as well as Casey from Women Helping Women down in there in Cincinnati. They are our presenters today, so I will turn it over to the both of you.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thanks for everyone for joining Casey and me in addressing this important topic, you know, really trying to do some proactive thinking, which I know we're all doing already and have been doing around addressing and balancing, you know, how the proposed rules are going to impact and already have impact, obviously, students in our communities. So what I'm going to do is do a really brief summary of the proposed changes and just highlighting some of the ways that we've been thinking about them here at Xavier. Then drawing out some of the potential issues and impacts and strategies to address that we've developed here at Xavier that seem to have had some positive impact. And then Casey, very importantly, is going to offer us some thoughts and perspective from the community advocacy organization perspective. I think it's important to note that Xavier and Women Helping Women have worked very collaboratively together for the last 6 years and on a lot of different levels, supporting Xavier students. And if there is a takeaway, I guess a top takeaway from this webinar, it is how critical that partnership is, especially in these times of anxiety and confusion and change in terms of how they impact students in our community. So I will jump in and start looking at some of the proposed changes on the next slide. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds here. I think we've spent a lot of time. Carrie, if you don't mind doing the next slide. We've had a lot of, you know, time and discussion sorry, I'm just waiting for the next slide. Carrie, are you on?
Yeah, what slide do you want me on?
There you are. You know what? I think there was a delay on my end, so you're perfect. Now it just popped up for me. Sorry about that. I'll be patient. So, you know, just highlighting again some of the proposed changes that have really surfaced as, you know, sort of top priorities here, and I think across the country, as demonstrated by those, you know, 100,000 plus comments received by OCR. So first, of course, is that narrow definition of sexual harassment, which I think, unfortunately, you know, can set up a dynamic either in reality or, in some ways, more importantly, in perception in our communities, both our campus and external communities, where rather than allow a space to potentially proactively address more sort of initial beginning lesser conduct earlier, we may be getting into more of a sort of wait and see until something bad enough happens framework. I'm still, Carrie, I don't know, I'm still on slide 2. Mine just went to 4. It may be that I have delay on my end. So in any case, sort of setting up this wait and see until something bad enough happens framework, which I think is particularly challenging given what we know, for example, around the likelihood of escalation of abuse in relationships within that cycle of violence, the escalation of stalking behaviors. So I know that's been a topic of conversation here. I think the next, probably number one top concern for institutions and individuals, experiencing or reporting sex discrimination is that proposed requirement for a live hearing and the institution's requirement to provide an advisor of choice to conduct the quote, cross-examination. There are so many practical, logistical issues with this piece, which I think were duly noted in the comment period, without even getting into, frankly, the question of, how significant is the chilling effect going to be on reporting or folks wanting to participate in our processes, how it may impact the reporting party in a hearing setting. Certainly raises questions about what kind of technology, capacity, resources, setup we might have. So again, I'm just sort of naming some of the top issues that I really think are impacting certainly Xavier students in terms of my dialogue and engagement with them. The other big piece, I think, was, this piece about under the proposed rules that informal resolution, which for me is it's a very broad term, and I'm not sure we all institutions or all community members have the same working definition of what we're talking about in terms of what that means and what it could constitute. But in any case, under the proposed rules, that informal resolution, the use of, is possible any time before a determination of responsibility, which raises a whole host of questions and concerns that we're certainly hearing and really diving into here as we anticipate the rules coming in. One, given the long-standing research indicating that use of at least some forms of informal resolution, such as mediation, are not only not effective but harmful, certainly in intimate partner violence cases, and in particular, how would institutions safeguard against these informal processes not being coercive or unfair, unequitable, potentially providing a way for the responding party to continue asserting power and control in the relationship. Other questions that have come up on our end, what happens if the parties reach a resolution and then one party backs out of the agreement? Does it automatically move to a formal process? So some logistic issues. If the informal resolution if that process ends without a resolution, can the parties use what they learn through or have learned through that process in a formal proceeding, whether it's internal or external? And then the biggest question for me when I think about the leeway that this gives institutions is if via an informal resolution, if part of that includes a party's acknowledgement of a policy violation, which for those familiar with restorative justice, that is at least my understanding of the starting point of RJ, is a person acknowledging what they've done. If that's part of any informal resolution, and then as part of that informal resolution, the responding party is able to stay on campus, if they violate the policy again or do harm to another student, does this, how does this impact the campus? Does it raise safety issues, obviously, how does it reflect on the liability issues for the institution since they were on notice? So it feels like those questions were definitely not answered by the proposed rules, and I'm sure like all of you are hoping that we'll get some clarity along with in the new rules. So moving on to the next slide, other key pieces that I think are really germane to our topic of sort of how to engage and address students' rights on our campuses. One, that second piece around allowing space for schools to essentially sort of narrow their jurisdiction, if you will, around off-campus conduct. There was the whole study abroad component. And I think what needs to be said about that is that, it really, if an institution makes changes in response to that leeway, it really will create a lot of questions and lack of clarity about sort of where, when, what, in terms of the institution's obligation to address the on-campus effects of sex discrimination from off-campus conduct. And it makes, I think a very challenging, set of information for people who are impacted by sex discrimination. It's already very challenging to understand these systems and choices and options and resources, let alone if a person is in a traumatized or compromised state. But again, we're going to need to be clear, whether OCR is clear or not, about, what are we still going to be responsible for responding to in terms of the effects. So if a student reports that they were sexually assaulted on study abroad, and then they're sitting next to the responding party in their biology class, under what umbrella or policy or piece of Title IX or not are we going to be acting or not? I think if we don't make that clear to our student and employee community, then it will have a chilling effect. We all know that the sort of the more we have lack of clarity, the more barriers we create to reporting. And I know that we have all worked so hard over the last 9 years to remove those barriers of confusion and lack of clarity. And I think we're going to have to, in some ways, sort of start that process again, depending on what these rules look like. Couple other pieces before we get into some strategies to address these issues. With the proposed rules shifting from, having language around implementing interim measures that would not unreasonably burden the reporting party, to shifting to not unreasonably burdening either party. I think over my years, certainly working with ODHE and doing trainings under the Changing Campus Culture Initiative, I think the question of how to do interim measures, how to assess and implement in an equitable, effective way has probably been the number one question that I have gotten from colleagues, or number one concern, especially on the smaller campuses where there's sort of less options, less movability. And I think this, adds another layer to that, a different layer, frankly, where we're looking through a lens that is a little asking us to really look at, what the burden is on both parties while the process is pending. Along the same lines, the proposed rules obviously contemplate a higher standard and a hearing process around institutions assessing the necessity of an interim suspension and emergency removal. Last piece, at Xavier, we spent a lot of time when the proposed rules first came out with General Counsel and the Dean of Students in my office and kind of the key folks around the table, trying to envision the intersection of our Title IX, our sex discrimination-related policies, and the broader student and employee code of conduct, given some of that proposed rule language about, how they can be separate. And I think it's been challenging, particularly after all of the years of focus under the Obama administration, guidance around integrating our policies, having one cohesive policy, to make the process for both parties more accessible, equitable, and to bring down barriers to reporting. So just quickly sort of naming some of the top of mind. I'm sure on your campuses there are other, just like here, other issues that surface that you're wanting to do some proactive thinking on. But I did want to name and make a few comments on some that are top of mind here. So, excuse me, going on to the next piece, and I've named some of this. I think the issues we're all living, sort of how the unknown is impacting our campus communities, potentially impacting our relationships and dialogue with our community partners as we all, try to predict maybe, what is going to come down from OCR, when, how much time we'll have to implement those changes. So again, I think the impact, we're all really living through that, and I know the students who are engaging with Women Helping Women in the Cincinnati community, are expressing that anxiety as well, just trying to understand, where we're going in terms of policy, what changes we'll make, if any, and how we will effectively communicate those. Certainly risks raising and reestablishing reporting barriers. I think it'll be really interesting to see and potentially very disconcerting to see, what institutions, and I know, from a Xavier perspective, how the release of these new rules, depending on how it all, comes out in the end, will we see a drop in reporting? And, we're going to be watching that really carefully to make sure to communicate that back to OCR to make sure that we're tracking the impact of these issues. Obviously, specific concerns from an institution level, which I know a lot of my colleagues are really struggling with, many of whom were already really challenged in, recruiting folks to be on conduct hearings or, sort of finding enough capacity in terms of investigation, which are real concerns. Title IX folks who are still wearing multiple hats, which I know can be extremely stressful, or disconnects with university leadership, not quite, comprehending the scope of Title IX and all of its glory, I guess, all of its iterations. So some specific concerns around, financial impact, human resources. Obviously a whole host of institutions shifted to a single investigator model, sort of under the last, 8 years of thinking. And now, depending on what comes out in these rules, are going to have to do a very significant about face and with resource connections to that about face. A few colleagues of mine, more than a few, have really talked about, how do we have the expertise and capacity to especially deal with if we end up, having to provide an advisor of choice that's, quote, aligned with the party. Obviously, I know we're all asking ourselves, what does aligned mean? Are we going to need to provide lawyers? I mean, all of these questions that have come up. And again, sort of the practical logistical equitability. And then, of course, the big picture, it's sort of from the minute to the large, is just, how are these new rules and the way that institutions across the country decide to implement these, how is it going to impact the progress that we've made in really moving the needle on not just reporting a very underreported set of circumstances, but also on just the visibility and activism around these issues on our campuses. So I think the jury is still out on that, but it's certainly something that is on Xavier's radar. So turning to some response strategies that have been helpful here at Xavier as these shifts in OCR's framework, approach, and then the proposed rules, which has obviously been sort of a couple year evolution. Now, we'll see the outcome of that maybe this summer, maybe this fall. Again, we need to be talking about all of this proactively now with key constituents, including students. Maybe students are the priority in many ways. Around, and also to acknowledge, that going down the rabbit hole of over 100,000 comments and the what ifs of what these final rules may look like, is certainly very important that we're doing that. And obviously I just outlined some of that here. But I think it's as important, if not more important, that we're bringing together those key partners proactively and really visibly recommitting and recommunicating to our campus and community our approach, our mindset, whatever the final, quote, compliance framework might look like. So really talking with our student leaders and with our colleagues and with our community partners about, our desire to be planful around how we will, when the proposed rules go down, and I hope, throughout this whole evolution under this new OCR leadership, to have language and spaces in which we share that language, not once, not twice, but in an integrated, holistic way, how our work in this area is, and this is sort of a Xavier approach, mission-centered, holistic, compassionate, and creating opportunities to share that mindset and approach and methodology with our communities. I think we need to be prepared to share what that looks like concretely, not just words about fairness or commitment, but to be prepared to share, how is this going to impact our policy, if at all, and how will it impact implementation, and to really be strategic in a proactive way about how we'll do that, via campus communication, town halls, forums, campus media. As noted here, I think one of the strategies that's been pretty effective here at Xavier is, anytime we've gotten sort of information from OCR around the proposed changes, or when most of the big key guidance was rescinded when DeVos first came on, is to really have cohesive, not just communication from Title IX, but joint communication from Title IX and then university leadership. So just as an example, Father Graham and I, the president of Xavier, we released a joint letter, and we'll plan to do so again when the proposed rules come out. And it makes a difference because there's a cohesiveness and there's not a disconnect perceived between leadership and Title IX. Some of these, other pieces, it really requires casting a wide net where we share the information. I'm sure you all have the same experience. There's this core group of faculty, staff, and students who are highly engaged in these issues and are tracking what's happening, which is, a relief and a very good thing. But there's this whole swath of folks who, up until now, maybe are under that misunderstanding that this has nothing to do with them, or that nothing like this will ever impact someone they know, which of course we know is not the case. And really thinking through, how do we get the information and sort of meet those folks where they are, so that they're not caught off guard and have a clear sense of where we're headed and why. And again, I'd say that wide net needs to go, across to students who may not be engaged, and it also needs to go up to the Board of Trustees so that they can effectively understand and communicate what, in this setting, Xavier's approach is going to be. Because I think it's just as important for the Board of Trustees to understand what's happening, because they are communicators to a much broader community, and as board members really need to have a strong handle on that. Again, they don't have to be experts, but I need to have an expert relationship with them so that they can, provide at least a brief response, and then make sure to connect whoever they're engaging with to me. And then finally, just on this slide, I think we all have a sense that it's a good time to really double down on our prevention education efforts and to integrate some of this changed language, if we need to, in some of our prevention education, again, to reiterate what are the resources, what are the policies. I think it'll be also interesting to see how this might impact in the upcoming years, even this year, our climate survey data. That's something I'm going to be looking for to see, is anxiety around this surfacing in our climate survey data. And I think it'll be interesting for ODHE to see that on their end. And then just in my final slide, reiterating a few strategies that have been very helpful here at Xavier, and then also which we plan to employ and deploy in the future when the new rules come down and as they do, is to, again, partner with student leaders. When students can talk to students articulately and with authority on what we're doing and why, that message gets through in a whole different way. So I'm planning a whole series of sort of meetings and open forums with our student leaders to facilitate with them, because they can get more people in the room, and I think it helps to see me next to students presenting together. I intend to, potentially try to up my visibility, access to me, certainly to keep pushing, as we always do, but particularly prioritize our relationship with Women Helping Women as a community resource, our confidential advocate here on campus, just to make sure students are very clear in times of confusion and challenges, to have that safe, confidential space to really think through what are the options, rights, resources, in terms of, Title IX, criminal, the whole thing. Now is the time, certainly. And then the last thing I'll say before I pass it over to Casey is something that we do regularly here at Xavier, and I certainly regularly do, is to really proactively engage with local media to share what we're doing in response to this, and to make sure that that's an outlet that we are providing a proactive message to continue to demonstrate that Xavier wants to, is interested in being leaders in dialogue around these issues, even when the issues are challenging or muddy or, unclear. So really leveraging the relationships that we've built with local media to try to get ahead of the messaging around this and reassure our community about what we're doing and why and how we're thinking about it. So I'll stop there. I think I saw maybe one question, which maybe we can save to the end, but from here, I'll pass it over to Casey.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. So my name is Casey Frazee-Katz. I am with Women Helping Women, and we're located in greater Cincinnati, so we cover Hamilton, Butler, Brown, and Adams counties. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk about campus-based services and how we navigate space depending on how proposed guidelines, if they're adopted or if they're changed, modified, et cetera. We have been in this community for more than 40 years, and we will be here regardless of what the proposed changes are. So that was what I was hoping to talk a bit about, with how community responses or partnerships with institutions and communities or other agencies can really help support students trying to navigate these processes. And I think, too, stemming from or kind of coming off of what Kate was talking about, working with community partners, one of the models that we have seen be very effective is a blended interdisciplinary support team. So people might be familiar with a SART, a sexual assault response team, or some communities have a DVCC, a domestic violence coordinating council. There's a campus-based model called a CCRT. There may be other iterations, a coordinated community response team. We are part of this at Miami University. We work on campus at Miami University and also the University of Cincinnati. And Miami has just received a grant from the Department of Justice to create this CCRT to work on campus to be able to strengthen support for survivors, looking at models of how they can respond in conduct hearings and things like that. At this point, the University of Cincinnati doesn't have a formalized team like that, but there are teams and departments on campus that come together to talk about these issues. And so that's what I wanted to highlight, is just the various roles that people have and how they are different, that students have different needs that students will need to address in a variety of ways. So there certainly could be needs around reporting something to the university receiving academic support. There could be an issue that someone's looking to work off campus for something, if there's a criminal case, if they need to get a civil protection order, if there are other legal supports that they need, if there's a need for immigration legal services as well. That's something that I think this is where a community agency can really come in to help support students, because the university has its reach to a point of what the university is able to cover, and then other agencies like legal aid, like community-based advocacy, and other organizations can help step in that role. And law enforcement, certainly, we partner with law enforcement in all areas, all counties where we operate. And if you would, advance the slide. So in terms of that level of community advocacy, so trying to increase that level of connection and support. So a community agency typically then is able to support someone from start to finish, ideally, of whatever it is that they've experienced. For us as an agency, we do hospital response, so that may be the first time that we meet a student or someone in the community through domestic violence and sexual assault hospital response. And then, of course, if they're a student, we help them follow through with anything that they'd like to see happen on campus, if that is reporting through Title IX so that they can activate anything that's available to them through accommodations, through just procedural justice, something that maybe they're looking to see happen to the person who committed that against them or assaulted them. Also being able to support them throughout, so that can be emotional support as well, through support groups, therapy. Our agency does offer therapy services. Usually, at least that we're familiar with, there certainly are many institutions that may also have mental health services available to students on campus that they can access. One of the perks, I think, of being a community agency is that sometimes students are looking to access services that maybe parents or family members won't have access to that information, or there's a fear that they'll have access to the information. And depending on what kind of FERPA releases that the student may have on file, depending on the level of understanding and consent for those documents at the same time. One of the other perks with the community agency, and I think certainly this will depend on the community agency and where people are coming from, is an open qualification for services. So for us as an agency, the only qualification for service is that someone self-reports that they are a survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. We do also serve human trafficking survivors as well, to the degree that we can, and then we refer to relevant agencies for anything that we're not able to provide. That certainly is something that if there's a student who, let's say, needs to take time off, I think depending on the institution, they may or may not be able to access services while they're on leave. If a student needs to leave that institution, but they're still locally based, we are still able to serve that student with what it is that they need. And maybe sometimes even try to help advocate to the institution if they're looking to take a medical leave, come back from a medical leave, if there's an issue with classes, et cetera. And in that way, our services can be streamlined and they're continuous, that we can support someone throughout the entire process, whether that happens on campus, whether that happens off campus. And certainly that's an area where we see that there could be an increase in community-based services if the proposed guidelines then do adopt that only cases that are happening on campus within those campus limits are investigated by Title IX. And certainly each institution will make their own changes. Some institutions are saying that since they still have a code of conduct, of course, that they need to adhere to, that they may have some leeway in terms of being able to support students with that, even if officially Title IX may not support any issues that have happened off campus. So again, with us, it's continuous. We have no qualification that an incident happened on or off campus. So we're able to help them throughout that process. If they're looking to transfer to a different institution, again, we can still provide services as long as it's within our framework, or get them connected to another service provider, if maybe they're from a different area or they're moving away to maybe go to school in a different place. And I think in that way that gives us broader access, or that the student has broader access to services. There's also, of course, the level of confidentiality. As an agency, all of our services are free and all of our services are confidential. So when someone calls into our hotline, that's something that they're not charged for. That's something that is able to stay confidential. All of our advocates on campus are also confidential. At the universities where they work, staff are mandated reporters, so that does give a special relationship with advocacy that students are able to access services without any fear, ideally, without any fear that anything would happen. Certainly some students are still concerned about once they share information, what will happen, but we try to walk with them through that process so that they understand anything that's shared stays with the advocates, that we always get consent if there's anything that they would like for us to share to try to help them through whichever process it is. So trying to balance out those needs, again, throughout the community. And then if you would advance, thank you. So just a few changes post the Title IX guidance that we wanted to walk through, and then some successes. So one of the issues that we have seen on one of the campuses where we work is that there's some amount of cross-examination. We also work with another institution that allows some level of cross-examination, but through using technology so that someone isn't necessarily in the same place or hearing the question spoken by either of the parties in the hearing, to try to lessen some of the issues surrounding that. There certainly are concerns around the interim measures, the assessment or the implementation of them, that with the focus from the Department of Education on parity for the accused, that it may unduly burden survivors who then may need to rearrange their lives or make changes that are harder for them to make. For example, if there are two students who may be within the same program, so there may not be multiple class offerings, if there may be past the point where they have larger classes that may have many sections available, and they're down to a very finite amount of options, that can be a little bit more challenging again for survivors. I think this also lends into what Kate was talking about with the progress that had existed being walked back a bit, and this is one of those issues that was so nice for a period of time that survivors were able to not have to rearrange their lives more so than needed. Certainly there are issues that always arise. Certainly one of the issues as well could be longer timelines, that if there's not the 60-day timeline for investigation and adjudication, then it could take the semester, it could take longer than the semester. There are implications if the person who is the accused is graduating, and then the university wouldn't have any jurisdiction over that person once they've graduated. So there could be issues that come up with that as well. So trying to, I think for our advocates, it's walking through what that advocacy looks like and how that changes if the Title IX proposed guidelines are adopted as is. Again, we've advocated for students before changes and will be advocating after any changes. But that will just modify how we need to go about it, who we can talk to, how long it will take for someone, how we can help prepare someone for the process. Certainly that's something that our advocates do. If someone is engaged, let's say, in any kind of court process, criminal court or civil court, those processes can take weeks to months, at the worst or the highest. Sometimes it can take years. So I think that's part of making sure that students are still getting what they need on a timeline that makes sense. Because this can be very stressful. Sometimes students then are not able to complete courses, or their grades may suffer, or they may need to take a leave of absence. So I think our advocacy will just need to change in response to how these changes, what is adopted. And then around the conversation of equity and services for respondents, that will be something that will need to be addressed further once we have a sense of the finalized guidelines of what exactly equity looks like, and the differentiation of maybe stress from trauma, that someone who has been a victim of a crime is someone who's been traumatized and needs certain services and has a right to certain services. And in the state of Ohio, there are certain victim rights. And so being able to focus on that, balancing that with any proposed guidelines around the equity or parity of services for respondents. So we look forward to those conversations. So then just on the next slide about successes. So we have seen an increased provision of academic accommodations and interim measures, so making sure that students do still have access to those services. That could even be parking accommodations as well, outside of academic accommodations. And then any kind of considerations after the Title IX office beyond the investigation. So again, we can work throughout to whatever degree that someone would like to engage in services, would like supportive advocates, that our work is on campus but also off campus. So depending on what it is that they want to have happen and how we best advocate for them with that. We've also seen support, and actually just recently there was a case that the respondent or the accused student had actually left the state after there was an initial filing and notification of a no contact order, and that an investigation was pending, and it had taken a while. The case was continued, and so luckily what we saw, the university make sure that there, I think at this point it was in the second semester of that investigation, that the hearing was able to happen, that the accused student did present for that hearing and was able to be present for that process. So there are those successes along the way as well, even thinking about parity and equity for the accused student, which is a focus certainly then of the institution, to make sure that their students are getting what they need, and balancing that for the student as well that this has happened to. So that's what I have. So I wanted to see if there are any questions, thoughts certainly about any of this related to survivor services or on the institution end.
So it does look like we've had a couple questions/requests. One, Kate, I think it's for that letter that you mentioned you and Father Graham had issued. If that would be something you might be willing to share with participants, would you like them just to contact you directly?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'm happy to share it.
Okay, awesome. And then Casey, I think to you, the question is, can we get a contact or a point person for one of the schools that you work with for the cross-examination piece in order to look at their procedure regarding direct cross-examination? So maybe an example or something?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to provide a contact.
Okay, awesome. So Kate and Casey, if you could just even into the chat room enter your contact information that you would like people to utilize, I think that might be helpful, and they can grab it that way.
Sure.
Fine.
Are there any other questions that anybody has for our presenters? He says that, Kate outlined a really great strategy in general, just in terms of, how to outreach and really network on your campus and in your community. As you look to approach the new year and whatnot, is there anything else, any specific responses that you've received thus far, Kate, or any indications from people that you think were particularly insightful or help guiding your work moving forward?
I'm so sorry. I was trying to figure out how to be in the chat. I was trying to figure out how to be in the chat room. Say it one more time. I'm so sorry.
So you talked about how, when the initial rules came out, you issued the letter and you kind of shared that with everybody, and you outlined your networking strategy. I guess I'm looking for, have you received any feedback from the community thus far as we all anticipate what's coming that has been particularly insightful or helpful to guiding your strategy as you prepare for the fall or winter, whenever these final rules drop?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Cannot do two things at once. Note to self. So we got, we got really positive feedback from doing this proactive sort of messaging and outreach to the community. And what was really interesting to me was sort of folks who I had not realized were sort of tracking this issue, like, in marketing or in our College of Business, really stood up to say, how can I help? And I'm really interested to understand this, to be able to communicate to my students the changes. So I think even though what Father Graham and I were saying was, we don't know the answers, but we are going to be communicating with you and, getting your input and feedback, et cetera. What the feedback we got was that just that messaging was really valuable and appreciative. And I think the assumption that even if you're not hearing from folks that they're not thinking about this or having conversations with their colleagues or with students, I think that would be a wrong assumption. So I think the mindset for us that's been really helpful in terms of informing how we approach this work is to assume that everyone has a role in thinking about this and communicating about this within their circles, and that it's really on us, and I would say on me specifically, to make sure that I'm casting, again, that wide net. So that's really informed my thinking, and it also helped me identify maybe some allies, some interested allies across campus that were not on my radar, but they got picked up because, I think probably because Father Graham was involved for the communication. So that was an interesting and informative moment, and 100% is directly informing how we'll go forward in our communication, because it made a difference in terms of, I think, small and large positive on Xavier's campus.
Casey, anything that you've seen similarly on the other campuses your organization works with, or? Casey, did we lose you?
Oh, sorry.
That's
we
okay.
get a lot of background noise.
You.
So I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question?
I just wondered if you had seen anything similar as to the communication pieces and picking up allies, where you didn't see, as Kate was just talking about, on any of the other campuses you've worked with in terms of outreach that they've done since the proposed rules dropped in November?
Sure. So I think we've seen that pretty strongly with Miami University, I think particularly with the grant application process and then receiving the grant from the Department of Justice, really trying to reach out to different partners and create this interdisciplinary team, I think has been incredibly helpful to the university and to service provision to survivors. And I think with some of the macro level pieces that Kate has mentioned and we'll talk about, I think that also helps in terms of creating norms. So regardless of the compliance framework of it, to be able to create those community partnerships to strengthen those services and find allies where maybe they hadn't been in the past, or engage people who maybe are doing somewhat similar support. We're on the supportive end, to see people engaged who may not have otherwise been. Great.
We did have a question come in. And I guess we're looking for just your general thoughts, not direct advice or guidance, I guess. The proposed regulations indicate that the decision maker cannot be the Title IX investigator or coordinator. I wear both hats, but do not render decisions. Is this okay?
So what I heard, and I want to make sure, and if this doesn't answer the question, whoever this is should feel free to reach out to me directly. I figured out how to put my contact information in the chat. What I heard was that you aren't a decision maker. My understanding, what I read in the proposed rules, is they're wanting separation of investigation and decision maker. Carrie, did I hear that right? That
You're wearing
the coordinator and investigator, but you're not the decision maker. Again, I can't give, legal compliance advice, but my reading was that they want separation between the person conducting the investigation, whether they're the coordinator or not, and the person who's making the decision. But again, you want to consult, obviously your general counsel.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, too, also waiting to see what the final language looks like. Right. I'm sure there was plenty of feedback on that point as well, just even what I saw as to how we're defining those roles or what those boundaries may or may not be or what that looks like. So definitely, but I would go with what Kate said, too, about talking to your general counsel and or the Attorney General's office and seeking their opinions on that as well. as you make your preparations and whatnot. I will also just say, too, for any of those of you that are Title IX coordinators that are on this call, there will be the July gathering of the Title IX coordinators. I'm letting that open for y'all to talk about what you want to talk about with each other. So I'll have some structure to it, but it's going to be very loose. And I will also just say, too, pending budget and all that sort of stuff, one of the things I'm looking at from the Department of Higher Education is also some follow-up on investigator training, conduct officer training, and those pieces once the final regulations do drop, so that way we can kind of begin trying to work through that a little bit, or hopefully within that time frame, since that's a moving target as to when, if ever, those final regulations will come. So other opportunities to pick the brains of others doing this work across the state as well as outside. So any other questions I have not seen come through? Any final thoughts, Kate and Casey, while we wait to see if there's any last minute questions that come?
Not for me.
Not from me.
All right. Well, thank you to the two of you for speaking on this topic today. I know we'll all continue to work together to find solutions and continue to move Ohio forward to change our culture. But thank you for your partnership and your willingness to support all our campuses and the efforts we're trying to make across the state. And thank you to all of you who joined today. If you'd like a copy of the webinar, you can just email me directly. And I will be happy to send you a copy of that later today. But thank you to all of you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully you've got sunshine wherever you're at. So take care, everyone. Thanks.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.